consequences that we're gifted with. When we're growing up, we have an internal map, a memory, in which everything grows out from you. Your friends, family, parents, the elders, role models, government, celebrities, they all start to build hierarchies internally, and you start to see how they play out. The better you can articulate these figures, you can start to simulate story. And from those stories, you can abstract meaning, so allegory, a political truth or a philosophical truth on how to conduct between one another. And we see throughout history, every culture has their own mythos, religion, story, and some of them draw themes from each other. Sumerian is an interesting one. Kings that lived for thousands of years, now only hundreds. People came from the skies, angelic figures that give humanity knowledge, where they develop and establish culture. There's ideas circulating that these people thought that they were slaves originally to these kinds of gods, now freed in some way in the civilization that they live in. These are forms of cultural engineering that indoctrinate their children, where the few generations that came from being nomadic find reason to align with a cultural hierarchy, some form of monarchy or rulership over them, and engage in some form of capitalism. Some system that rules over them, and it gives them reason to believe in these things. Beyond that, they abstract morality and where the laws come from in these epics, these stories. When I look at Western canon literature, specifically Dante's Inferno, you see Dante near the end climb up Lucifer, and he's on the other side of the earth, and where he's now set to meet with God. And in this story, God is like the collective unconscious. He is a collection of everything, as he made the world in his image. And he's such an overwhelming force for Dante, but he realizes, since everything's made in the image of God, there must be a version of him inside God too. And so he starts to translate God through the image of himself inside God. Strange concept, maybe. But what this is entailing is that you have the map of yourself that extends outwards to friends, family, and all the other hierarchies around you. And then we project ideas into the unknown until you reach something at the top of all of this, aligned with all these sort of dualistic things, good and evil, hot and cold, light and dark. Something at the top must be all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present. Just values, just placed on this map according to their powers. And from that hierarchy, you go from the idea of God at the top, all the courts of angels in heaven and earth, and the layers of hell. And all of these things are something that you develop through articulating them. The aesthetics don't matter, the names don't necessarily matter. Just the understanding of what those symbols mean in alignment. And then from this, once you grasp these symbols, they are your interpretation. They are part of you. And you start to develop yourself more. And you can abstract from those symbols. Simulation of how all these values play out in the social drama, in where you can learn to be the best person possible, and you can see the figures in this collective unconscious that you've aligned emerge, transcend from just the potential into reality. You manifest into your character to be the best person you can be. And this is why morality is learned. We're not born with that capability. Children don't know anything. We don't strike a child for when it does wrong, unless you want them Pavlov trained, disciplined. But to teach them requires this process in where monks and scribes have tried to give this idea, but it's always twisted, misconceived. Where spirituality is not to be hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo, but simply the pursuit of morality, truth, and then God as the lens of your culture. It's something that you look through, like how Dante met with this force and translated through it, through the small image of himself inside God that is the image of everything, to understand the collective unconscious and simulate from that the best potential version of himself. I believe that it's been a grand effort for people for thousands of years. We're talking monarchs and rulers and priests who have safeguarded the wisdom of developing spirituality to put them under a roof in a cult or religion to justify the rule of a monarch and other political ideologies. During the 1500s, there were popes and prominent figures of the Catholic Church that used language and theological reasoning that in part justified slavery and colonization and exploitation of indigenous peoples. Even the language human being was used to describe us as animal and to justify slavery, which in my opinion is going against exactly what they preach. If you look at Adam and Eve, the apple reveals us as naked and vulnerable. We now see that there is evil in the world. Also good. And that now it's our duty to leave the garden, leave nature, and become civilized people through developing the prefrontal cortex. And that all these stories hold allegory, deep wisdom to be good people. It's a consequence for evolving as social creatures. When one has the impression that another human being truly grasps being evil and is struck by them, there is very few ways of being able to justify such horrendous acts. But you see, when I say we assume they understand evil, in my argument they don't. or else they wouldn't commit the act to begin with. We see characteristically through psychopathology, as a consequence of the lateral thinking, they're not able to delve deep enough to construct that allegory, to live in the prefrontal cortex. You see damage there. You see retardation there. Something went wrong, where they live externally, and they'll need the constant verification from others that where they stand in the world. They need to have a higher sense of self with narcissism. These traits are still characteristic in psychopathology because they can't put themselves in a worldview. They're ill. And so when dealing with criminal behavior, when we look at evil, you have to understand that these people are ill. And striking out and harming them and labeling them as evil, in my opinion, isn't right. Because they don't know right from wrong. They're more animalistic. But that doesn't mean they're animal. It means they're damaged. The reason why they're so keen to do wrong, at least that I can class, two main things: maladaptive desire and Schadenfreude. We see with lateral thinking, you can't delve down into social relations because of either paranoia or other complications or just damage. You now look for short-term gain. That having relations with people for some reason is no longer viable or worthwhile. So now there are bad things on the cards to get what you require through social interaction. We're thinking rape, murder. It delves into other things where narcissism might play into it. I'll get into this briefly. Firstly, maladaptive desire, though. What is desire? Desire is something that stops us from dying, basically, initially. Hunger. I don't want to die of starvation. Thirst. I don't want to die of dehydration. The feeling of cold or too hot. Tiredness. They are feelings to make us get stuff, right down to I might need a certain thing in my diet, and so my gut is telling me I'm hungry for a certain thing. And we see problem with sugar now because there's so much of it, but our body is wired to constantly seek for it. And because of the abundance, we end up with diabetes. Beyond this, there is fetish. Fetish is something that occurs from the lack of something early on in life. Or trauma too may confuse someone to go a certain way, but trauma also may cause a person to work themselves to the bone. I'm afraid of being broke, and so I have to work and work and work, or it could aspire to something even worse where I'm afraid to be seen as unwealthy for whatever reason, and you go through ways of maybe even valuing that title more than the well-being of other people. And you see how this will play into short-term gain over long-term benefit in social relations with lateral thinking.